Hello everybody, I welcome you to this event. I'm Tanja Paffenholz from the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative from the Graduate Institute here, and we are organizing this event together with Tufts University, and we're very happy to have the colleagues from Tufts over here, and we are presenting the preliminary results, I think, of a very exciting research project on the role of legitimacy in the governance of fragile states, and I think it's a very pertinent topic. Also not only in the academic world, but also in the policy world, to really see how the legitimacy of state is challenged, under what conditions, and what are the main factors that are influencing that, and what are the implications of that. But I'm really just here to say hello from our side, because I leave it to my colleague, Eileen Babbitt from Tufts, to give an introduction about the project and the background. And from the Graduate Institute side, we had basically taken part in one of the sub-projects, and that's on inclusion and legitimacy, where I will also talk about later. So I'm not taking too much space now, and would really like to invite you immediately, Eileen, to give us an overview of the project.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Yeah. Good morning. My name is Eileen Babbitt. I am a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and also the director of the Institute for Human Security there. Brochure in the ante-room if you're interested in more about the Institute. The research that we're going to be discussing with you today is being done under the administration of the Institute. It's funded by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We've been working on this project since the fall of 2014. The purpose of the grant was to, from Carnegie's vantage point, was to encourage faculty at schools of international relations, graduate schools in particular, such as Fletcher, to focus more on policy-relevant research. And to be better at communicating the results of that research to decision makers in the policy world, both in the United States and internationally. The project from the Carnegie's vantage point is called Bridging the Gap. And the idea is that there's often a divide between these two worlds, that academicians are not really mindful of policy issues as they're framing or communicating their research results, and policymakers are not so good at seeking out research results to inform their decision making. So the idea is to try to bridge those two worlds. As I said, the Fletcher project began in the fall of 2014. Technically, we are wrapping it up in September of this year, so we still have a few more months on the grant. The topic, which my colleagues will explain in more detail, is enhancing legitimacy in fragile and conflict-affected states, and we'll say more about why we chose that and what that actually means and the implications in just a moment. In the Fletcher faculty, we have 8 faculty members who are working on this project, 5 of whom are here today. And we have also several doctoral students who are not, unfortunately, able to be with us. We also have partnerships with several key international organizations. One, as Tanja just mentioned, is the Inclusive Peace and Transitions Initiatives here at the Graduate Institute. We're also partnering with the Overseas Development Institute in the UK and their Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, and the African Union, their Peace and Security Department, and we have several other organizations with whom we have been working, but those are our main partners. I want to briefly introduce our team members who are here today, and in the order in which they will be speaking. First is Ian Johnstone, Professor of International Law, Diane Mazarana, Associate Research Professor at Fletcher and Research Director at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University, Katrina Burgess, Associate Professor of Political Economy, Tanya Paffenholz, whom you know, Director of the Inclusive Peace and Transitions Initiative here at the Graduate Institute. I also would like to introduce our colleague Daniel Dresner, who's sitting in the front. He's a professor of international politics, and he's been working with us as the internal evaluator for the project as we've been proceeding. Our colleague Alex Dewall, who was supposed to be here today, is unfortunately unable to join us because of a family situation, and so he was not able to travel to Europe. Each of the speakers will talk briefly, we hope, about 8 minutes, because we would like there to be much more time for discussion and interchange with you after the presentations. I also would like to remind you and invite you to a reception that will be taking place at the conclusion of this seminar. It will be downstairs, and outside and to the left, I believe there will be staff to help us find our way to the food. And you are certainly welcome to join us, and we'll be available for informal discussion then. So I'm going to turn now the podium over to my colleague Ian Johnstone, who will begin the substantive presentations.
Do the clicking here. Good. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you all, thank you, Tanya, I guess, and everybody for joining us and for hosting us here. This is a great opportunity. I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about the overall framework of our project, and in particular this notion of legitimacy and why we chose to focus on it. As Eileen said, the focus of the project, the substantive focus of the project, is how to build, or what it takes to build legitimate political authority in conflict-affected and fragile states, and more specifically, what peace builders, donors can do to enhance the legitimacy of governing authorities. It's a difficult topic. We chose it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because in the policy world, in the policy literature, there does seem to be a sense that there's a correlation between legitimacy and peace, or legitimacy and stability. There's plenty of evidence of that in documents that are coming out of the OECD and the World Bank and the UN, European Union and whatnot. And the underlying theory behind that is basically peace is more sustainable if when there's legitimate political institutions, because they tend to foster voluntary rather than coerced or bought compliance. That being said, there is very little consensus on what the sources of legitimacy are, or on the extent to which any particular source of legitimacy correlates with peace or with stability. We define legitimacy in fairly simple but widely used terms: popular acceptance of a governing authority's right to exercise that authority. And that fairly simple definition actually has three fairly difficult concepts associated with it. So the first is that it treats legitimacy as a subjective concept, meaning it's about perceptions and beliefs, not about objective normative standards that apply universally. Second, it puts a focus on internal perceptions of legitimacy, whether and to what extent those who are subject to authority believe those who are exercising authority to be legitimate. Okay, so we're more interested in what the citizens, the inhabitants of conflict-affected and fragile states think about their governing authorities than what the outside peace builders and donors think, although, as I'm going to point out at the end, there's a symbiotic relationship between those two things. And third, while discussions of political legitimacy tend to focus on national institutions, central governments, that definition leaves open the possibility that legitimacy can be accrued at the local level by local authorities, by non-state actors even. Okay? The list of potential sources of legitimacy is very long. It could relate to process factors, how a government comes to power, for example. Is it elected? Sometimes described as input legitimacy. It could relate to substantive or performance factors, like how well a government delivers security, delivers health, delivers education, okay? Sometimes called performance legitimacy. And often in conflict-affected fragile states, legitimacy is accrued or depends on things like tradition and religion, ideology and identity and whatnot, okay? Our project doesn't make any assumptions about which are the most relevant sources of legitimacy. Odds are, and certainly our findings bear out, that it rarely comes down to a single source. It's usually some combination of the above, and there are variations from society to society. We've divided the work into these 4 working groups: political inclusion, delivery of basic services, security sector governance, and corruption in the criminal justice sector. Diane Mazurana and Katrina Burgess are going to be talking about delivery of basic services. Tanya will be speaking about political inclusion. Unfortunately, Alex isn't here to speak about security sector governance, so we're not going to be able to concentrate on that. And the corruption work is still sort of in the mid-phase, so we didn't really have strong findings, so we're not ready to present on that. But let me just say a couple of words about security sector governance and corruption in the justice sector to give you a feel of what the overall project looks like. So this is the kind of the headline findings we have so far on security sector governance. And the idea there is that in many conflict-affected states in Africa, the focus of that working group is on Africa. In many of these conflict-affected African states, security is provided by actors at multiple levels, both state and non-state actors. These different actors compete for authority in a political marketplace where loyalty is bought and sold. And in these environments where authority and legitimacy is deeply contested, jumping straight into rebuilding national security institutions, national security forces, is problematic and can often be counterproductive. On corruption in the criminal justice sector, this research, which I said is still ongoing, looks at the dynamics of corruption in a larger socio-political context, and in particular looks at the multiple drivers of corruption and how they interact. And there's a focus on the role of social norms in the work that they're doing. The image there just sort of illustrates what that means. This is a program established in Bogota, Colombia, where drivers hold up cards, thumbs up or thumbs down, with respect to each other to let them know how they think their driving is. And this is to sort of get at the expectations about proper driving, traffic violations and whatnot. And this was part of a larger project to deal with corruption in the transit police force. A couple of sort of broad implications that cut across the working groups, and I'm going to conclude here. First of all, our research suggests that process is as important, if not more important, than substance when it comes to local perceptions of legitimacy. And the most important, the most meaningful, the most important procedural attribute is meaningful inclusion. Okay? And that finding really cuts across the 4 working groups. It's at the heart of the political inclusion group, but we've discovered it cuts across the 4 groups, and it seems to hold in most cultural contexts. But because inclusion may be used to gain legitimacy for strategic rather than normative reasons, I think a topic that Tanya will be discussing, care has to be taken to ensure that meaningful, genuine opportunities for participation and voice are developed as opposed to mere window dressing. Second, local authorities and community or faction leaders often compete with central authorities for legitimacy. Which entity is worthy of support varies among different population groups, regions, and social classes. Okay. This creates a dilemma for peace-building programs because in a state-based international system, the natural interlocutors of the peace builders, the outside actors, is the central government. Bypassing the central government, bypassing the central authorities can create problems. So our sort of broad finding here is not necessarily bypass those authorities, but rather work with those authorities to open space for local levels of governance and local governing authorities. And then finally, I think as everybody understands, there's often a disconnect between the perceptions citizens have of their governing authorities and those that the outside actors have. There's a disconnect between internal and external perceptions of legitimacy, further complicated by the fact that there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. Okay? That often external legitimacy is sought for the purpose of accruing internal legitimacy and vice versa. And so as part of our ongoing research, which will extend for the next couple of years, we hope more needs to be done on trying to understand that complex and dynamic relationship. Okay? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diane, who's going to focus on delivery of basic services. And I have the responsibility of figuring out how to get to the desktop here. Which one's yours? That one? That one?
All right, thank you, and thanks to Tanya for her gracious hosting of us. What I want to talk with you today is about some of the research we've been doing around basic services and perceptions of governance legitimacy. Really trying to understand better, is it what you do or how you do it? And I'll be presenting some of our overall findings from our first panel, and then Professor Burgess is going to start talking about some of the findings we're having, preliminary findings around what's going on with migrant families, migrant households. So as we know, I think we're all very well aware, poverty tends to concentrate in countries experiencing armed conflict. And in 2015, 51.3 million people in 35 countries around the world were affected by armed conflict. One of a very important tool that's being used in peacebuilding, which has been really state building, which is really operationalized as peacebuilding, is this idea that if you provide basic services, if the government is seen to provide basic services to its population, it will accrue some legitimacy. That citizens, upon receiving basic services, which are very essential and important, will feel better about the government, will think that they're more legitimate, and that this will help stabilize those governments. And this idea is extremely widespread among donor agencies, and in 2014, donor governments spent $36 billion in those countries delivering basic services. It's one of the cornerstones of the addressing peace building and state fragility kind of tools. And so what we're interested to look at is that real? What's the evidence behind this assumption, which is driving a very large policy assumption and also programmatic reaction? So I'm a member of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, and that consortium has a number of partners, and our briefing is outside, so in the briefing outside you can see all our partners, as well as some of the key findings that we've had on this. But we're working in 7 countries, and in 5 of those countries, actually 8 countries now, we keep expanding. In 5 of those countries, we have done a panel survey. And a panel survey, of course, is you would survey households and individuals at a set point in time. You get your baseline data, and I'm going to be sharing baseline data. And then several years later, you return not only to the same household, but the same individual, and you ask the same questions, and then you look to see what's happened in terms of change over time. Panel surveys in fragile and conflict-affected countries are extremely rare. And so what I want to present to you is some of the baseline data from our first panel. And I'm the overall team leader for Uganda. So for example, in Uganda, our data is representative of 3.63 million people in the 2 most conflict-affected subregions. And overall, the study interviewed over 9,000 households. So what we sought to do is to look at households' experiences and people's experiences of the quality of access and their access to education, water, and health care, and if there is any relationship to how they perceive governance both at the local level and at the central level. And remember, the idea is that if you have more access to basic services, we should be seeing increased positive perceptions at the local and central levels of governance. What we found is there is no linear or consistent relationship between people's access to basic services and their perceptions of governance at state and at central and local levels. Second interesting finding was that it does not appear to matter for perceptions of governance legitimacy who delivers the services. One of the strong assumptions being made is that it's very important, remember, think about this kind of virtuous cycle that's imagined in these assumptions, which is it's very important that the state or those governance authorities be seen to deliver those services. That's how they're going to accrue this kind of legitimacy, which helps stabilize them. In fact, our data finds no relationship between who delivers services and perceptions of governance. So what does matter? Well, one of the things that really does matter is the quality of those services. Where high-quality services are offered, you will see an increase in people's positive perception of governance at primarily the local level, but also at the central level. At the same time, you can make matters worse. This is one of our strongest, most robust findings, which is that poor quality services result in more negative views, both at the local and central level. So what are some of the implications for this? Well, one is that basic services should be continued to be provided because they're life-saving and life-enhancing. And we should be very cautious about the idea of then loading on this extra kind of peace-building governance legitimacy on top of them. Sorry. The other thing that we've seen that really matters is not only quality, but process. And here what seems to really matter is what we're calling meaningful participation. So do people have access to community meetings about basic services? And what's important is that most community meetings are about basic services. So our basic services called, our meetings called on basic services, do people attend those meetings? Are there complaint mechanisms? Is there transparency in how you would make a complaint? When you have these factors and people participate in them, particularly community meetings, you will see a positive increase. You'll see an increase in their positive perceptions to central and local governance. So what are some of our key implications for policy and programming? One is that there's a need to emphasize and invest in high quality services. It is simply not enough to deliver basic services. There has to be money invested in making sure that those services are of a high quality. And what we found in our study, and again, this is our baseline, so we'll see what we find in our panel, our second panel, which is we're analyzing right now. But what we found in our baseline is that high quality services had to do with I'll just give you a health example. When you go to the health clinic, health practitioners are actually there. Medicines are actually there. And of course you might all be nodding, of course, who wants to show up? But very often the way that basic services are provided is you're ticking boxes and you're monitoring, evaluating on the basis of how many clinics did we build. Not are our clinics staffed, is the medicine do we have the medicines, and when you get a diagnosis, is it actually accurate? How long do you have to travel to get there? So investing not only in the delivery of basic services, but in the quality of those basic services. The second is also investing in the kind of mechanisms that appear to be necessary for meaningful participation, meaningful inclusion. Investing in community meetings, investing in complaint mechanisms, investing in transparency, investing in working with local authorities to actually respond when people have complaints. And overall what we're seeing is that this is one of the ways in which citizens and the citizens start having a more interactive and responsive relationship between people and the state. So now what I'd like to do is ask Professor Burgess to talk with us about some of the findings on migrant households.
Okay, great. So So my role in this working group has been to look at the ways in which migration may intervene in some of these relationships, either directly or indirectly. And the two countries for which migration really matters in this sample are Pakistan and Nepal. So in 2014, remittances represented 30% of GDP in Nepal, a very high share, and in Pakistan about 7%. In the surveyed districts, about 25% of the households in Nepal and 37% of the households in Pakistan had received international remittances in the last 3 years. So for both countries, remittances are significant. Quite a significant share of households have some experience with migration. So the first step was to look at the findings in the existing literature that seemed relevant. And 3 kind of pop. And most of these studies are based on, the lion's share are from Latin America, mostly Mexico, several from Africa, and then there are a handful of studies from the Philippines. So less fragile states, at least when the studies were done. But I thought maybe the findings would be replicated in Nepal and Pakistan. So one is that migration-affected households tend to be more critical of their own government. The second one, which is perhaps the least surprising, is that migration-affected households tend to have better access to services and to rely less on the state to provide them. So they rely more on themselves or on non-state providers to access those services. And then the third finding that tends to be to emerge from these studies is that members of migration-affected households tend to be more inclined to challenge authority, to demand accountability from their governments, particularly at the local level, and to engage in non-electoral forms of political participation. So the idea was to see whether these hold in the cases of the conflict-affected regions of Nepal and Pakistan. So I'm going to share with you very quickly the preliminary findings. First of all, in contrast to most of these existing studies, migration does not appear to make households more critical of their own political system. In Pakistan, we found no relationship between whether a household received remittances and what they thought of the government. This may not be surprising because something like 96% of the households in the Pakistan districts have a negative view of their government. So migrating isn't going to make it worse. It doesn't have very far to go. In Nepal, however, it was the opposite, that there was some somewhat tentative, but some relationship, positive relationship between having received remittances and what households thought of governance. Particularly at the local level, and particularly when remittances made a meaningful contribution to household income. This is an intriguing result. It needs more research to understand why. Second of all, consistent with existing studies, remittance households are more likely to rely on non-state providers of services, with the exception of schools in Pakistan, across both countries. And this wouldn't be problematic if the overall finding of the study that it doesn't matter who provides services held in every case. But when we dug down a little bit and disaggregated non-state providers, we did find that in the health sector, there was a negative correlation between use of private health clinics and perceptions of governance. So this makes it a little bit worrisome that these remittance receiving households are more likely to use private clinics if you're worried about legitimacy. And finally, also consistent with existing studies, and this is probably the most interesting and maybe actionable finding of the study, is that remittance households in both Nepal and Pakistan appear more inclined to engage in non-electoral forms of political participation. In both studies, remittance households were more likely to use complaint mechanisms than non-remittance households. And in Pakistan, although not Nepal, remittance households were more likely to participate in community meetings. And this was, in Pakistan, this was quite striking. So not only were they more likely to participate in these meetings, they participated at a higher rate. So just to give you a little taste, while only 19% of non-remittance households participated in 3 or more meetings, 47% of remittance households did. So it's a significantly higher level of engagement in these community meetings where you discuss these basic services. And given the findings of the study about how important inclusion is, this seems to me to be an important finding and at least signals to policymakers that they should pay attention. I'm not quite sure what they should do with it. We're working on that. But they should pay attention to the migration variable when thinking through what's happening at the local level and what sort of policy response might be appropriate, and maybe leverage the greater activism of these remittance households in some way. Thank you.
So when we started looking at inclusion, then we didn't know actually that inclusion became the main feature that was across all the cases. So we had a focus on what is the connection between legitimacy and inclusion in the understanding of taking it as a hypothesis, as you developed in the beginning, like it's one of the things that might affect legitimacy. What we did is basically here at the Graduate Institute for the last 5 years, we have a project called Broader Participation in Political Negotiations and Implementation, which is a qualitative data set with 40 case studies, where we looked at all sorts of processes and the linkage between inclusion and reaching agreements and implementing agreements and how inclusion works, practice, meaning when we talk about inclusion, maybe I can have the next slide, is basically how are people made part of decision making. But what we did, we looked mainly into high level official peace negotiations, constitution making processes and political reform processes, where we see that the state legitimacy is challenged by either armed groups or political opposition, and you are in a transition phase, which I think are many of the countries we're dealing with. So we looked in this broad spectrum of the transition from either war to peace or from sort of protest uprising to establishing either existing or new forms of governance. So that is our data set. And then Eileen came and said, is there something on legitimacy? There must be. So that basically was the kick for us to see, so how can we look into this aspect in particular. And in that sense, I was actually a bit skeptical in the beginning that this is really a promising road. But thanks to the push from your end, we found it actually quite exciting now what comes out. And these are really preliminary findings. So briefly, I want to raise what are sort of the main findings, and they say what are the implications. So the first thing is what we found is that if you talk about and I think this is very different from the service delivery, like on the local level and in the community level. Yeah, you include people, it makes all sense. It has been long done in development, participation, so that was nothing new. But participation on a high political level, where you include more groups than sort of either the main, the government and the main contesting armed group or political parties, that was, you had here a very different hypothesis from, let's say, mediators and those who manage transitions from the outside and from the inside. And here, a main hypothesis was basically inclusion screws the process. Because inclusion is complicated, how can you involve all these people? You cannot sit like in a Rousseau kind of environment of a social contract where you debate the whole of the nation. Of course, we have these forms like national dialogues and other things. So what we did is we looked into what are these forms of negotiations that have more stakeholders, and we astonishingly found that you have very often a lot of stakeholders involved. Doesn't mean that you have the whole nation, but you have all sorts of forms where you have either more political parties involved, you have civil society involved, you have women groups involved, you have consultations, so not only at the table, but you have broader, you have this. So the point is, why should existing governance systems, governments, and also, let's say, armed groups, why should they say inclusion is the road to go? Yes, let's please challenge us, we discuss with everybody, we get more issues on the table. Why should they do that? It makes kind of no sense. That's why a lot of, for example, high-level mediators will say, it makes no sense, we cannot sell this, this is a normative thing that comes from these normative UN agendas. And so the interesting thing is, looking at what we found is that actually that the most, both armed groups or opposition party challenging government and governments, for them it was the main reasoning was legitimacy. They need legitimacy, internal, sometimes also external legitimacy, but mainly internal legitimacy in order to be a recognized party in these negotiations. And for them, a main feature of getting legitimacy is having broader inclusion. So the interesting thing is contrary what sort of high-level mediators often tell you. It's complicated, the parties don't want them, the parties want it. But the interesting thing is, why do they want it? And I can have the next slide on that. So we found sort of a very interesting reasoning. And if you make it very simple and you would look into whether civil society, whether political opposition, whether governments in power, you can all cluster them in these two sort of fields. There are those who want to stay in power and who are persistent to change, and there are those who have a change agenda. The ones with a change agenda, you can cluster in two different subgroups. They're the ones who don't want really change for the country, but they want change in power, meaning they want to become the next president and government, which is a different agenda from you change into really addressing the root causes of the problems in the country. You move forward, you want to have inclusive forms of governance, and you name it. So very different. So, but they still want change. And they challenge the existing government either in violent means, with armed rebellions or uprising, political protests. So this is the right camp. The left camp wants to stay in power, and it's usually the existing government in power. And so the interesting thing now, what we found as preliminary finding, which I find overly exciting, is that both camps take inclusion as a means to get legitimacy and get what they want. So and that's really astonishing, because you pull sort of back and want to stay in power, but you say, okay, fine, I'm challenged. And if I'm challenged, I have to give something, apparently. So I include more. And if I include more, it looks like I'm giving something. I'm ready to change. But the result of it should be I stay in power. Egypt is a case in point where you see you have a national dialogue, and then the whole thing sort of was controlled by the government. So you can cluster cases into these formats. And then you basically go back, and at the end of the day, you look like, I was so open, here I am, and I'm still in power. It functions extremely well. So on the right side, you have the pro-change actors who say inclusion is the main means. Because if I'm inclusive, I'm going to get it, because then I can put all sorts of things on the agenda, and then there will be an automatism of change, and this government will then, of course, be voted away, and there's a new government coming in. And then we have on this side, when they are both sort of successful or not, you will see either a new government with a non-change agenda or a new government with a change agenda. But for me, the interesting thing is inclusion is the main vehicle to get legitimacy to do that. What are the policy implications on that? The policy implications are, I think, as challenging as yours, because they're challenging existing hypotheses. They're challenging, first of all, that inclusion is not that difficult to achieve, because you can buy them in very easily. So mediators, if you think it's not doable, just do your homeworks, first implication. Second implication is that if we look into how the international community sort of manages transitions and inclusion, it's very much driven by a normative-only angle, like, let's get more in because it's really good, because then the good forces are all in. It's not driven by a reality-based power understanding of the situation, where you think it's not about the technicalities of how you do inclusion. That's what, when we are asked often to give policy advice, they ask us at the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative, come in and tell us how to do that, how to involve these more actors, what are the modalities of inclusion. It's a technical approach to it. It's not a political approach where you say, wait a moment, why are they doing inclusion? And then see, is an inclusive process a real one, a quality one, a meaningful one, where you have selection criteria, you have representativeness. So you can check whether you're on the left or on the right angle into looking into the quality of how this inclusion setup is done. That's the first thing. And that's what needs to be done. So it's not just presence of more actors, and that's what also on women inclusion, we see always it's presence of women. It's not about the quality of the engagement. So in a way, similar findings. So then the other thing is, who are those forces of resistance? Who want to pull back? And the international community has a tendency to only look into the pro-change camp, both in civil society, both in political actors. And they're deliberately ignoring power holders of resistance, and it's not, and focusing on the process. Let's design a nice process, and then it will be a good outcome. And deliberately ignoring that the resistance, having this understanding of like the resistance to change. What are these actors doing? What is their strategy? Look at Colombia now. The opposition in the peace process is ready to do a campaign against a potential referendum to come to agree on the peace agreement and the change. And they're very well prepared. And the government is like, oh, what's going on? There's nothing we can do. Of course, they could do a million things. But this awareness, and the international community is like, oh yes, opposition is not really in favor of peace. But if this referendum in Colombia will fail, it's the end of the process. So there's not enough effort on what can we do in order to address the non-change oriented actors. So I think that has implications in moving away from a technical only process design focus, bringing the politics back and the hardcore power assessment and reality-based understandings of it, and sort of thinking and merging kind of the normative with the reality-based assessment of politics. I'm stopping here. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Now comes the fun part. I mean, this was fun too, but I get to be a little bit like the talk show host here. So we did pretty well, keeping it short. We have some microphones, I see. So questions. We'd like to hear from you and see if you have any thoughts, questions. There's a lot of different topics on the table. We tried in our research to cover a lot of different angles on this legitimacy question, pull out some connecting tissue, but also keep some specific findings under specific topics. So based on your own interests, your own experience, questions, things you didn't understand, right there? Yep, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jörn. I'm a consultant at the ILO's Fragile States and Disaster Response Program. First of all, thank you for your thought-provoking presentations. It was really interesting. My question, and I have many, I don't know which one to choose. Maybe on the basic services, sorry. Have you also looked into employment issues? What if you said the who doesn't matter, who delivers the services, but what if it's the people themselves who deliver the services? Did you look into that?
Why don't we take a couple of questions and then we can come back to you if you have more questions.
Hi, I'm Susanna Campbell.
Hi, Susanna.
Yeah, hi, Eileen. So I have a couple questions, and it deals also with your kind of survey methods and controls a little bit. So I think the first question is for Professor Mazarana. It's about how you measured quality, right? Because if you're surveying perceptions, you also have to have an input of quality in relation to those perceptions, so how you dealt with that. And then you said one implication is that we need to be careful of loading government and peace building on top of service delivery, and I'd just like for you to expand on that a little. And Professor Burgess, in relation to Nepal, one of the fascinating things about Nepal is the kind of infiltration of political parties and different ethnic and class or caste systems throughout the society. And to what degree were you able to control for that in the survey, which may have influenced political participation, or even which parties these actors were affiliated with and involved with, and also what's the timing of that survey? That's it.
Maybe one more?
Hi, Michael Parmley, a retired American diplomat living in the Geneva area. Looking at the issue of legitimacy always brings to my mind the issue of reconciliation. To what extent are the different actors, be it those outside the system or those inside the system, committed to the principle of reconciliation, which so often in divided societies, no, we're the group that's in control. No, the group that's coming in is fighting the legitimacy and fighting to establish their own legitimacy. To what extent either are committed to genuine reconciliation, to me is a fascinating factor. I mean, there are groups like Sant'Egidio that are committed to that, but there aren't very many groups around the world that are committed to that in a genuine sense. And so I'm wondering to what extent that's a factor in the search for legitimacy.
Excellent. Why don't we start with those? Diane, would you like to begin?
Great, thank you. So first on the where people deliver their own services, for example. So definitely we saw that. We saw that most people provide their own water, right? Government or non-government or any different group is not providing their own. People provide their own water. And when people provide their own water, they rate it to have pretty high quality. But again, we didn't see a correlation between, and most people get, across the board, most people get their healthcare services and their education services from government, for example. So we didn't, again, but we didn't see that if their own water quality is good, it didn't matter that they were providing it. And so it ties into the second question, but I'm going to get to the measure in just a minute. What does this really matter if we're loading kind of issues around governance and peace building on top of basic services? Well, let me just answer that with a couple of thoughts. And these are things that have come up in other briefings where that we've been doing in the last few days. One is, okay, let's say in our second panel, because this is our baseline data, let's say in our second panel our findings hold that delivery of high quality services, it doesn't matter who the actor is, you're going to see an increase in people's positive perceptions of local and central governance. Okay? Okay, well, a lot of groups are putting basic services and they're trying to do high quality work into ISIL-held areas. And we definitely saw that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the study is being held, there's almost no government provision of services. It's all international. And they are putting services in and trying to improve the quality at the time of elections. And in the survey, in the second round, we saw that the higher quality of the services, the more positive they were towards the government. So one could say, well, humanitarians, neutrality, impartiality, of course. So, but what we're seeing in the baseline, maybe we'll see it in the second panel, is actually by providing these services, you are having an influence on people's perception. Take it a step further. Someone said to us in one of our briefings, if this is really true, it was kind of only half in jest. Do you think you'll start seeing, provision of poor quality services in areas where they want to undermine the government? Because you can see you can see the opinions tank. Let's look at the National Solidarity Program out of Afghanistan, the flagship program for reconstruction and reconciliation, interestingly. In Afghanistan, 20,000 villages where they choose their own development programs. Perception surveys there show, as those development programs are in, this is in general, people's attitudes toward governance holding or improving. Those programs are ending. We see opinions tanking. So one of the questions we get asked is, how sustainable is this? I mean, what it shows is it's pretty volatile, right? It's pretty volatile. So then we get questions from humanitarians, okay, well, this is all having a lot of political effect that we're not wanting or intending. Should we not be providing these services? What kind of dilemma does this put us in? So I think to really take a step back and say, basic services are about people's lives, right? Be very careful to start weighing all this other stuff that you're going to do with peace building, stabilization, everything on top of these services. Kind of be aware of what's happening, but be very cautious with all that. And also, what's interesting is in some countries, major donors are being kept out because the governments fear that if those actors are seen in their country delivering services, that the legitimacy will accrue to the international actors. Our data doesn't support that at baseline, but there's a fear and they're actually refusing to let people in. So it's a very contested terrain, I would say. And then in terms of measuring quality, I can just give you some examples. All of the SLRC data, it's all open data, it's all online. So if you search Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, you can get access to all our data, all the surveys, all the tools, and all the regressions we did for all of our studies. So it's very open data. But for example, we had questions around how long does it take you to get to your healthcare provider when you reach there? Are people present? Are the medications you need available? Do you feel like you get a good diagnosis? How are you treated? So we looked at all of these different kind of levels. And it's important, I think, too, because what we can see is where we see medical professionals are available, medications are available, and many countries, as you know, they may have health clinics, but there's no medicine. Or you may wait all day or have to come back 2 days later because no one shows up for work. because they haven't been paid in months. You know, these kind of things, and you think, oh, this is so basic. But when you look at a lot of the M&E around it, it's how many health clinics did you build? How many books did you print? How many schools did you build? How many textbooks did you deliver? It's not, oh, are the teachers there? I mean, it seems so basic, but it needs to be that further push. Yes, we know it, but we're not doing it particularly well.
Yeah, and just a few comments about political parties and Nepal. And as a political scientist, I love your question. And the survey doesn't have any political controls. It has these governance questions, right? But it doesn't give any sense of a political context. And so I think more qualitative research is necessary to really unpack, especially Nepal, which is where so many things are going on. The baseline survey was done in 2012, and then the second round in 2015. So it's going to be very interesting. So you have an earthquake and a constitution and all sorts of things happening in the interim. Another interesting finding, just to throw it out, the 3 districts in which the surveys were conducted are Rolpa, Ilam, and Bardian. And interestingly, even when you control for income and education, Rolpa has the most positive perceptions of governance. Rolpa was the epicenter of the Maoist insurgency. I don't quite understand why that's the case, but it's a very intriguing finding that needs further investigation.
Yeah, on the reconciliation.
Yeah, okay. Maoists are in balance.
On the reconciliation. So basically, people go for inclusion, not for reconciliation at first. It might happen at a later stage, but the intention is not reconciliation. The intention is very rational choice, power sort of considerations, where people think if I'm more inclusive or if I'm there, I'm getting either let's take a civil society opposition movement, I'm getting my issues onto the negotiation agenda. It's not about reconciling with different groups. It's about getting your issues on the agenda, your agenda through. That the question is then, does it lead to reconciliation at a later stage? And that, of course, depends on the country constellation, but that's often more a long-term thing that comes out of it. And definitely, it's not sort of the inclusion that is has this intention from the rationale of the involved actors, yeah? But it may, the rationale of sort of the international community, for example, is usually also not reconciliation when they push for inclusive sort of setups. Their rationale is this gives a broader agenda, and then if it's a broader agenda, people have ownership, and then you can implement agreements and reach agreements. So the reconciliation part is seen also from the outside very separated. Then we do reconciliation projects. We bring them together, we make dialogue projects, we call San Egidio in, they bring them together, and then you have reconciliation. So it's often split up from the political process that goes on, as if sort of this is something else. Different people do reconciliation, the other one do the political stuff, yeah?
Yeah, and just to reinforce that from the point of view of the research that's been done on security sector governance, the sort of political marketplace thesis about loyalty being bought and sold as opposed to voluntary compliance suggests that it's not about reconciliation, okay? It's about holding on to power or gaining power. Maybe at best it's about establishing some kind of stability. But that being said, if acknowledging the political marketplace and even working within the patronage systems from the point of view of the outsiders may well lay the foundation for reconciliation sometime in the future, but it's not going to be an automatic transition.
Excellent start. More questions? Woman over here. Can you hang on 1 second? We'll get you a microphone. Yeah.
I have a very strong voice, so okay.
Can you introduce yourselves, please, when you
Yeah,
ask a
definitely. I was
question?
going
Thank
to do it. Yes, I'm Maria Rosaria Iorio. I'm a political analyst, and I've been working in Africa for more than 15 years. So I'm very much interested in these issues of legacy. I have a number of comments, if you allow me. The first one is on political parties. I think your study is very, very interesting. What I would like to see a bit more is some regional type of approach, because I feel that, for example, if you talk political parties in Africa, we are not yet even to a multi-party democracy, you see, in many countries. we are still in monolithic type of systems. So the issue of legacy and legitimacy, it appears to be played in different types of arenas. For example, religious or traditional chiefs type of consultations, which are not political parties, however, they play a very, very important role. So I could say they are a bit of underground consultations instead of the official consultations we are used to as external actors when we look at it. The other point, which I think is very interesting also, is, and I like very much your point on what external founders and international organizations want to do in the region. Unfortunately, sometimes it has a countereffective impact because people see it as an influence that they don't really want to have. So it's a delicate type of issue because many governments are seen sometimes as a result of external influence, and they lose legitimacy. And that is not good for governance and is not good for participation. So I don't know, what is your perspective on this? And the last point, migration. In the region, migration is, of course, regularly, because as you know, we have states which are artificially defined. So the migration is not the migration we see in Europe or the way we see it in Europe. There are families in Sierra Leone, they have cousins in Gambia, they move to Senegal, they come back. So that is migration, but we don't see it as such, and it has an impact. So I'll stop here, although I'm very excited about the topic. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the very exciting discussion. My name is Sofia Tsislarkorpi. I'm a master's student at the Credit Institute, finalizing my thesis and submitting it in 5 days, and which is actually the reason why I'm here, because I'm writing on external peace engagement in Somalia, and I'm drawing pretty much on Alex de Waal's work on the political marketplace. And my question is related to the relationship between loyalty and legitimacy. And the thing why I'm asking about this is just because as far as I have understood, the buy-in of all elites is crucial for stability, to some extent, stability in patrimonial contexts, because these elites have control over violence. And that's why these loyalties, like it has been mentioned, buying these loyalties is crucial, because that provides kind of control over violence in these contexts. But when we talk about legitimacy, we're not talking in these terms. We don't refer to violence. We have a different vocabulary. So I'd just like to hear your comments on the relationship and between loyalty and legitimacy, because legitimacy relates to, and inclusion relates to the grassroots level, and just the perception of by people of the government, rather than having like a different approach to violence, or resorting to violence. So we are, okay, I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My name is Sarah Hellmüller from Swiss Peace and University of Basel. My first question is to Professor Maturana and Professor Burgess. I found it very interesting, your findings, and then also the focus on migration-affected households. And my question would be, were there any other disaggregation you could maybe tell us more about, any changes in perceptions from youth versus elderly people, women, men, from rural versus capital, etc.? Any other disaggregations I would be very interested in. And then to the panel more broadly, since this research project is also really to bridge the gap between research and practice. I was wondering what kind of channels or ways of transfer from the research now to practice you are thinking about. I mean, do you mainly talk with donors and policymakers, or to what extent you're also carrying these findings back to the people you interviewed or surveyed? Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Lily Adiambo. I'm glad to see my Professor Johnston. And it's fascinating what you guys have done, and I really commend you because you're dealing with very, they're quite sensitive issues and lots of dilemmas and cleavages. And I like what Professor Manzurana came up with, because when you presented, I was nodding because sure, you wouldn't get that kind of data because as our colleague presented, most of these countries are in transition, and most of them are very young kind of democracies. They're not democracies as yet. We are hoping that one day they'll be called legitimate democracies. They're very young. And you find that where people are at, if you look at it vis-a-vis the Western world, some of the things that we would say are obvious in terms of provision of basic services are not where they are at. So when you go to try to interview them, you are actually shocked that they're not finding these as issues. And that I want to bring out the fact that accountability from the Western perspective is very different from what you'd expect in some of these places. And that makes the research even more complicated because it then begs the question whether you may want to do this in another 10 years. Probably they would have come to another level and their exposure is different. And I don't know what kind of results would come out of that. So I just wanted to appreciate that and say that in real terms, there is the human, the behavioral part of it that it becomes very difficult for us to demand of you to present, but that is something that plays a big role in the outcomes of such a valuable research. Another aspect that I wanted to say, and you pointed it again, is about the tension that sometimes we have between, I work for the Humanitarian Affairs, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and we do respond to needs on the ground, saving lives and all that. But again, there is that tension whereby by providing the basic services, because when we provide that, we are looking at the human being. You know, we do it according to humanitarian principles. But then there's that dichotomy where you want to include and you want to negotiate with non-state actors, but then when it comes to legitimacy, when you go to them, or you're giving them that you're recognizing that they're in power, and then it becomes, you know, a question of where does, you know, not just the do no harm but concept, but where does the peace side of things and the justice side of things, you know, the nexus between that is a very difficult thing to unpack sometimes. Mm-hmm. So mine is more of a comment just to appreciate what you're doing, but also just a request that probably one of the things is going forward, it would be nice to go over this again a couple of years to come and see what has changed and what hasn't. Thank you.
Okay, let's give the panel a chance to respond to some of these about disaggregated types of power, especially in Africa, and the interface with violence and other sorts of ways of breaking down the data, et cetera. So,
great, thank you very much. We did do more disaggregation of the data, and in terms of what seemed to matter in terms of perceptions, some of you may know I do a lot of work on gender analysis. I was very interested, is there a difference in perception of quality or access to basic services and how it relates to perceptions of governments between men and women? We don't find a difference. We didn't find a difference. When you start getting into the subgroups, you'll start seeing some differences. But overall, we didn't really see it. Where we do find a big difference is in education levels. So the more educated you are, the more so the significantly more likely you are to have among the worst opinions of your government, both at central and local level. That has a gender breakdown because men tend to be the most educated. And in the areas we're working, you know, many of the women have not even a primary 2 education, right? The other thing that's interesting, which is in the briefings, if you go onto the SLRC website and you look at the work on Uganda, is we've also broken it out by experiences of war crimes. And what we find is that households and individuals who have experienced war crimes have the most negative attitudes, regardless of their education, their wealth, anything like this. They have the most negative, you're controlling for all that, they have the most negative attitudes of governance at both the central and local level. And I think that has enormous implications for reconciliation. Those households also tend to be, even 10 years after the active conflict is left, those war crimes households tend to be the most food insecure, the least wealth, the worst access to water, worst access to healthcare, worst access to education, and the lowest opinions of local and central governance. So one of the things we're seeing with those serious crimes is, or war crimes, is that the impact is long-lasting, and it's definitely affecting perception. In terms of transfer of research, what we've been doing is, at least for the SLRC, every country team has national partners and national leads who live and reside in those. So there's been extensive work at the local level and the national level. And what's interesting and has to do with some of the governance questions we've got in the past is very often there, and Professor Johnstone commented on, very often there's a lot of tension between local governance authorities and central, because they could very well be in opposition, particularly when you're in conflict-affected areas. Or if they aren't in opposition, it's usually because the local authorities have been imported from the center. So there's a lot of tension there, and there's also major problems with information flow. So when we're presenting some of our data, often, and we have these large representative samples of like entire subregions, for example, often it's the first time that the local governance authorities have actually got access to the information of what's happening to their populations. Even though the information was available for years at the central level. So working at the local level is super important. And at the national level, of course, you've got to influence the central governance. And then at the international level, like what we're doing here. So there's a real conscious effort at all 3 levels. The most briefings occur at the local and national levels, because that's where the change is really going to happen.
I just wanted to say something about the question about the relationship between loyalty and legitimacy, which I think is a really interesting and thought-provoking question, because we've been struggling with how do you measure legitimacy, right? It's very thorny. And I think one of the conundrums is, are we measuring whether people's legitimacy has been bought? So you can buy legitimacy, presumably, right? Or is it a sort of broader sort of construction of legitimate governance? And part of it is going to have to do with the way in which services are distributed. And we don't get at this in the survey, is whether they're distributed in a particularistic fashion, a sense to co-opt people to buy through clientelism, patronage, to buy legitimacy in a way, or are they distributed more universalistically, which is more consistent with constructing legitimate governance. And I don't think our data get at that, and I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that as well. I thought that was a great question. Then this is a loyalty versus legitimacy, and I agree completely. Who asked the question? Yeah, I agree completely that they're not the same thing. In some ways, they're alternatives, or at least from the point of view of the political marketplace. The notion being that you can buy loyalty, but accruing legitimacy doesn't mean buying loyalty or coercing loyalty among the population. It actually means gaining voluntary support from the population, getting to the point where the people are saying, you deserve my support, you don't need to buy it, you don't need to force me, you deserve it, and I'm willing to give it to you voluntarily. The implications of that, of course, are not, I would agree that you often do need to buy off the elites. To create that minimal level of stability, you've got to work within the system that exists as opposed to try to replace it with something else. But the sort of message is that's only going to take you so far, because loyalty that's bought or a system that depends on bought loyalty is very fragile. Alex has learned, the research has determined, for example, that violence against civilians is sometimes used to up the price of loyalty. In other words, go out and attack the civilians and then go make a deal saying, I'll stop attacking if you A, B, C, D. So you've got to move beyond that through mechanisms like inclusion to get to the point where it's more a voluntary kind of compliance.
Yeah, maybe also to that point, so what was a constant in all our case studies was really that the way the elites, and that means that can be the armed ones, it can be also powerful business elites, so depending on the case study, which type of elites, depending on where they are in the sort of, in the pro-change or the anti-change is one of the most crucial factors, whether this process has a chance to have sort of success. That means you set up a very inclusive process. It's entirely dependent on the elite sort of, I would say, buy-in and the way they see it, which doesn't mean, so from the policy implication would also mean, if you don't have that buy-in, you better get it. So it means also that it shows that you need to maybe have also outside mediated spaces, out of the sort of formal negotiation spaces where you have deals. You have Nepal as a case in point where you had in the Constituent Assembly very inclusive formats of representativeness of voting rights and everything, and it looked really inclusive. But then all the decisions were made outside of the Constituent Assembly by the traditional political parties that were anti-change, and they basically ruled out all the formal decision-making through sideshows, which were more anti-change than pro-change, which blocked the whole thing. So that means if you would have, for example, an outside mediated space, you better try to sort of be on the formal and the informal level. And that's what we see, basically, that if you have mediated processes, for example, from outside, that there is a focus on the technicalities of the formal space and not an acknowledgement about the informal power spaces that go around there.
Sorry, there's just one more question we didn't answer.
Well, was this the one about how we're disseminating?
No, this was about, this is about outside actors can undermine the legitimacy of the...
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead
so
on
I'll be
that
very
one.
quick
Yeah.
on that. Again,
Yeah.
an excellent point. I'm not sure I can say anything more than I agree. Although I'd suggest that it depends a little bit on who the outside actors are and how they go about supporting the local or national authorities. So I don't want to overstate the case, but for example, in Africa, perhaps African Union being up front as opposed to the World Bank or the UN or the European Union being up front may make a difference. But in either case, it suggests a very light touch. Don't come in with massive programs and say, here they are, expecting that the government is going to accrue legitimacy as a result of buying into that.
Am I allowed to say something?
Sure. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just based on experience, because I think it is also the time factor. There are many interventions, they start with an accruing legitimacy for government in the short term, but because they last too long, then amazingly, that same legitimacy becomes hostility against authority. So I think it's a matter of how long. That's one point. And the last one, sorry, is services costs on the budget of government. So most of the time, the reason why we have external actors is because national authorities do not have the means to buy. They don't have the money. So there is actually a failure in that case of government.
I think Kosovo is a very interesting case when it comes to this question, because here you have an outside constructive, almost narrative of an inclusive setup that legitimizes the state, meaning there's mainly Albanian Kosovarians are the majority. So when it came to sort of the negotiation of the autonomy and independence, the international community said the international community will not buy in sort of a discourse of nationality of a dominant ethnic group, because that was the sensitive, remember in the early 90s, that was the sensitive breaking point of that conflict. So only if that government would frame itself as an inclusive one that gives rights to the Serbian minority and is kind of a multi-ethnic state, which it is not. It's a state dominated by one ethnic group. So the whole question from an international legal perspective would have been, what type of minority rights are they giving to the minority? But the discourse the international community has created as a buy-in for the external legitimacy was, you are now an inclusive state. And you are all nice to each other, and it's going to be a really nice state. So now what happened is both parties, so to say, lost completely internal legitimacy, because the majority feels uneasy with this narrative, and the minority also, because they don't have rights. They're just somehow inclusive. So they constantly both have to battle for internal legitimacy, because the external legitimacy at that time was valued higher and has even constructed its own narrative of a new state.
Right. Yeah. And I think, as was pointed out earlier, this relationship between internal and external legitimacy requires a lot more investigating, because they're related, but how they're related and when one and how one influences the other is extremely important. And as external actors, often many of us in the international community, being aware of how we may be undermining internal legitimacy, not in a good way, is extremely important as we try to put our interventions together. We have time maybe for one or two more.
The research policy question? Do you want to address?
Oh, yes, just a quick one to Sarah, yeah. What we're doing and learning about the research policy divide, some of it is not going to be surprising to you, that personal relationships matter, that networks of people who know each other, trust each other, are comfortable with each other's work and have trusting relationships. Those are channels of communication that are still quite valuable. And creating those connections between researchers and policy actors is still very, very important, which means not only the initial contact, but follow-up and interaction, and having the policy actors be part of the framing of the research questions and therefore interest in the research results. So that is something still that we're finding. Can I just a couple more and then?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No. Secondly, we are experimenting with, but haven't got data to share with you yet, on using more of social media and electronic media. So as you'll see, if you go to the website of the Institute for Human Security, there's a connection to all of the briefing papers that you see in hard copy. And also we've made some short videos that are very specific, that have images and quick references to findings, with then links to longer research reports. So the idea being that the 2-minute video is the teaser that gets people interested and connected to the topic, and then can follow with more detail. Whether that is actually working well, we don't yet know. So we're still experimenting with that. Tanya?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think as a group we have not yet sort of shared the different experiences and have yet to analyze it. From our part, it's more like we are at the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative having the opposite problem. We're overwhelmed by requests from policy. And but the point is, what works and what does not work. What we see in this sort of short period of experiencing it is, as Eileen also said, I mean, publications, I had thought as a hypothesis, don't fly with policymakers. It's not true, actually. They do, but they are like an invitation for a dialogue. So when are you invited for what? So taking kind of invitations for whatsoever as a means also too. So, and then are we working, I think there is an over-focus on those who work on policy-relevant research on the sort of top-level decision makers, donors, international community. Sure, that's it. There's an over-focus because they come also with most demands. So we run after sort of delivering the demands. But for example, in Colombia, we're working also with the Catholic Church and who go down on the diocese level. and where you can't have these results fed in a very different way, because you can tell them also, like, who are the local power holders? Go for them, analyze them, understand, work with them. So we had long discussions, like, should they, so we did a mapping of resistance, like, where are the resistance on the local level when it comes, and the resistance came from local government authorities, from opposition mayors, came from business people, came from this. So to introduce sort of the power political analysis, even on the diocese level, and then say, okay, if you go for this resistance mapping, what is the implication then for your programs that you implement on reconciliation, on implementing the peace agreement? So I think it's very important that we move when we have entry points. And that entry point, for example, came through me being invited to being part of an academic advisory board for this project. And when we then thought, like, okay, that's not it. I mean, we can do much more on that and integrate this debate. And I think the problem we're having often, we think like, okay, now I have this policy paper, and then I look into a smart video or this and that. And often this is not the way it really works. It's really going to the heart of the dialogue. And then the problem is, of course, as a researcher, how do you have a mandate to do that? Have you time to do that? And do you know how to speak also the kind of languages?
One more lesson, and this is more of an impression than any firm lessons we've learned, is if you're trying to influence policy actors in governmental or intergovernmental organizations, target the mid-level, not necessarily the top, not the junior. And the reason for that is the mid-level has more time for sustained interaction. If we're talking about this interactive process, it means you don't want to just hand over some findings and say good luck. You want to work with them over a sustained period. Secondly, they tend to be more open to ideas that go against the conventional wisdom, or at least better able to work with those ideas that go against the conventional wisdom. And then related to that, often what they need is ammunition to help them persuade their bosses, their authorities. And so they probably are maybe sympathetic to these unconventional ideas, but on their own they can't get very far with them. If you've got a body of evidence in an academic community that said, this is what the evidence is telling us, you have stronger.
Do either of you want to comment on that? Okay. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time together. We do have coffee and some nice little food items to share with you downstairs. And that means that we'll be there and we can talk a little more informally if any of you still have questions. I want to thank Tanya and her wonderful crew of staff and everyone, her team, for hosting us, for setting up this lovely event. And thank you to all of you for coming and being with us today.
And just make sure.
Oh, yes. There are copies, even though we've spoken about electronic media, there are some old-fashioned hard copies of briefing papers and the Institute for Human Security brochure out on the table outside, which you're welcome to take.